The North Vietnamese Army lieutenant couldn't stop shaking during the interrogation, not from his wounds. Those were superficial, not from fear of captivity. He'd been trained for that. He was shaking because of what he'd just experienced. When the Australian intelligence officer asked him to describe the patrol that had captured his squad, the lieutenant's answer came out in fragments. We set up camp, cooked rice, told stories, went to sleep. When we woke up, they were already there, in the camp, with us. I don't know how long, maybe all night, maybe watching us eat, maybe watching us sleep. The officer pressed for details. How many Australians? The lieutenant shook his head. 7, but they were 15 meters into our camp, not outside, inside. They slept with us. That wasn't an isolated incident. That was doctrine. Between 1965 and 1972, Australian forces in Vietnam developed and perfected a tactic so psychologically disturbing, so physically demanding, and so tactically effective that American commanders who observed it called it brilliant, and their own troops called it insane. The Australians called it a close ambush. The enemy called it something else. They called it May Rung Nang, the ghosts who sleep. And the reason American troops couldn't stomach it had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with what it required a human being to endure. You're about to learn about a military tactic that got buried in the official histories because it was too uncomfortable to celebrate. The Australian Army doesn't advertise this method. The veterans who practiced it rarely discuss the psychological cost. But the results speak for themselves. Kill ratios that made conventional infantry operations look like amateur hour, enemy morale collapse in entire sectors, and a fear factor so potent that captured NVA officers would later admit they rotated units out of areas where Australians operated, not because of casualties, but because of what the tactic did to their soldiers' minds. This is the story of how a few thousand men from a country most Americans couldn't find, on a map made professional soldiers from a superpower military feel inadequate, not through better weapons, not through more resources, through a willingness to do something so fundamentally unnatural that it violated every human instinct about safety, comfort, and distance from danger. Stay with me. This gets darker than you expect. Vietnam, 1966. Phuoc Tuy Province. The Australian Army's 1st Australian Task Force had been in country for 4 months, and the American advisors attached to them were filing reports that made zero sense to anyone reading them back in Saigon. The Australians were getting contact at rates that shouldn't be possible. They were ambushing enemy units that American patrols in the same area never even detected. Their kill ratios were approaching 100-to-1 in some operations, and their method, according to multiple confused American observers, involved something the reports kept describing as unacceptable proximity to hostile forces. The province itself was a nightmare, not the dramatic mountains and rivers nightmare that photographers loved. This was 4,500 square kilometers of dense jungle, rubber plantations, and swamp that the French had failed to control, the South Vietnamese avoided, and the Viet Cong and NVA used as a supply corridor, training ground, and sanctuary. The terrain was claustrophobic. Visibility rarely exceeded 10 meters in the jungle, often less. Movement was loud. Every step cracked something. Every breath seemed to echo. The vegetation was so thick that artillery was nearly useless. Shells detonated in the canopy 30 meters above the ground, doing nothing but announcing your position. The Americans handled this terrain the way most professional militaries would, with overwhelming firepower, large unit operations, and maximum standoff distance. A typical American sweep through contested jungle involved a company or battalion moving in formation, supported by artillery on call, helicopter gunships overhead, and immediate extraction available. When contact occurred, the doctrine was fire superiority and maneuver. Dump enough steel on the problem that you could move to better ground. It was sound doctrine. It was professional. It made tactical sense. It also warned every enemy fighter within 3 kilometers that Americans were coming. The Australians looked at the same terrain and came to a completely different conclusion. If the jungle made movement loud and visibility terrible, then the advantage went to whoever stayed still and quiet. If the enemy owned the terrain through familiarity, then you had to become more familiar, not less. If firepower superiority meant nothing when you couldn't see the target, then maybe the answer wasn't more firepower. Maybe the answer was getting so close that you couldn't possibly miss. The men who would perfect this approach came from a military culture Americans didn't quite understand. The Australian Army in 1966 was tiny by American standards. The entire task force in Phuoc Tuy was never more than 4,500 men, but those men came from a different tradition. This was an army that still remembered being outnumbered at Gallipoli, outgunned in North Africa, and abandoned to fight alone in New Guinea. They had learned through generational experience that when you're the smaller force, you don't win through matching the enemy's resources. You win through doing things the enemy isn't willing to do. The soldiers themselves were volunteers, every single one. Australia still had conscription in 1966, but for Vietnam service, only volunteers deployed initially. That meant the 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, the unit that would become most famous for this tactic, was composed entirely of men who had chosen to be there, not drafted teenagers, not reluctant conscripts, professional soldiers and volunteers who understood that they were representing a tiny military in a war dominated by superpowers. Private Michael Walsh was 23 when he arrived in Phuoc Tuy. He'd grown up on a cattle station in Queensland so remote that the nearest town had a population of 140. He'd learned to track cattle, shoot feral pigs at night, and move through scrub without making sound. Before the army, that was just life. After 12 weeks of jungle warfare training at Canungra, those childhood skills had been refined into something the NVA had never encountered. Walsh wasn't special. Most of the men in 6 RA had similar backgrounds. Farms, stations, small towns where hunting and bushcraft weren't hobbies, they were how you ate. Sergeant David Kellaway was the one who would train Walsh and 36 others in what would become the signature Australian tactic. Kellaway was 31, which made him ancient by infantry standards. He'd served in Malaya during the emergency, where British and Commonwealth forces had spent 12 years fighting communist insurgents in jungle that made Vietnam look like a park. Kellaway had learned from EBAN trackers in Borneo, from British SAS instructors, and from 7 years of practical experience that the jungle wasn't your enemy. The jungle was cover. The jungle was concealment. The jungle was where you lived if you wanted to kill people who thought they owned it. In March 1966, Kellaway gathered his platoon in a clearing near Nui Dat and told them something that made half of them think he was joking. We're going to sleep in their camps, not near them. In them, close enough to hear them snore, close enough to smell what they ate. And when the time is right, we're going to kill them before they know we're there. One of the younger soldiers asked the obvious question, "Sarge, how close is close?" Kellaway's answer would become famous in the battalion. Close enough that if they fart, you can identify what they had for dinner. That wasn't bravado. That was the literal operational requirement. Here's what the Australians had figured out, that the Americans either hadn't considered or had rejected as tactically insane. In jungle warfare, the side that could stay quieter longer won. Not the side with more firepower, not the side with better technology. The side that could sit absolutely still in hostile territory for 48 to 72 hours, controlling every bodily function, breathing through their noses, communicating through hand signals so subtle they were almost telepathic. The side that could watch the enemy walk within arm's reach and not flinch, not shift position, not make a single sound. The Americans couldn't do it. Not because they lacked courage. American infantry in Vietnam demonstrated extraordinary bravery in thousands of engagements. They couldn't do it because their entire tactical culture was built on different principles. American doctrine emphasized firepower, mobility, and aggressive action. American soldiers were trained to take ground, to hold ground, to dominate the battlefield through superior resources. The idea of lying motionless in enemy territory for 3 days, eating cold rations without unwrapping them, pissing into a bottle you'd carry with you, and shitting into a bag you'd take home, all while enemy soldiers walked past close enough to touch, violated every principle of American tactical culture. The Australians didn't just accept it, they turned it into science. The training started at Nui Dat and was unlike anything American observers had seen. Kellaway and the other NCOs would take patrols into the jungle and teach them to stop being soldiers and start being predators. That meant unlearning almost everything conventional infantry training had taught them. It meant moving so slowly that a 5-kilometer patrol could take 6 hours. It meant freezing mid-step and holding that position for 20 minutes if something didn't feel right. It meant learning to identify every sound in the jungle so that when something human-made occurred, you knew it instantly. Corporal James Mitchell, a bricklayer from Newcastle before the war, later described the first time Kellaway made them practice the full ambush posture. "We set up in a clearing. Kellaway put us in position and said, 'Don't move until I come back.' Then he left. We sat there for 8 hours. It was 34 degrees. Mosquitoes everywhere. My leg cramped after 2 hours. Didn't matter. You moved, you failed." When he finally came back, he walked through our position like he was inspecting a garden. He stopped at one bloke who'd shifted slightly to scratch his leg. Kellaway didn't say anything, just looked at him. We all knew what it meant. That twitch would have gotten us all killed. The physical training was only half of it. The psychological preparation was worse. Because the tactic the Australians were developing required something that goes against fundamental human wiring. It required shutting down your fight-or-flight response while danger was present, not approaching. Every animal instinct in a human being says that when a threat is near, you prepare to fight or run. The Australian close ambush doctrine required you to do neither. It required you to lie still while armed enemies walked past, ate meals, told jokes, cleaned weapons, and went to sleep, all within a few meters of your position. Private Walsh remembered the first time Kellaway explained the full concept. He said, "You're going to set up your ambush at last light. You're going to pick a position along a known enemy trail or near a known enemy camp. You're going to get into position before they arrive, and then you're going to wait. They might show up in 2 hours. They might show up in 2 days. When they do show up, you're going to let them get comfortable. You're going to let them think they're safe. And when they're at their most relaxed, when they've posted sentries who are bored, when they've eaten and are getting ready to sleep, that's when you kill them. All of them. In under 30 seconds. Someone asked what happens if the enemy discovers the ambush before you're ready to initiate. Kellaway's answer was simple. They won't. Because you're going to be so still, so quiet, so invisible that they could step on you and not know you're there. The first operational test came in May 1966. Delta Company, 6 RA, inserted a patrol into the Long High Hills, an area so thick with Viet Cong that American units treated it as a free-fire zone and mostly stayed out. The patrol was 7 men led by Sergeant Kellaway. Their mission was reconnaissance, but their real objective was to test whether the close ambush tactic could work in actual operations. They moved into the hills at dusk, taking 4 hours to cover 3 kilometers. When they found a trail junction that showed recent use, they set up in vegetation exactly 12 meters from the trail. Not 50 meters, not 30 meters, 12 meters. Close enough to hear whispered conversation. Close enough to identify individuals by silhouette. Close enough that if something went wrong, there was no room for error. Then they waited. Hour 1, nothing. The jungle settled into its night rhythm. Insects, frogs, the occasional rustle of something moving through the canopy. The patrol didn't move, didn't talk, breathed through their noses, became part of the terrain. Hour 4, movement on the trail. Kellaway's hand came up in the signal they'd practiced. The patrol didn't even shift their eyes. They'd positioned themselves so that the trail was in their natural sight line. No head movement required. What they saw was a Viet Cong sentry, walking slowly, rifle ready, checking the trail. He stopped, 5 meters from Walsh's position, lit a cigarette, stood there smoking for 6 minutes, while Walsh watched through vegetation so close he could see the sentry's facial expression in the lighter's glow. The sentry moved on. The patrol didn't relax, didn't whisper about the close call, didn't shift position. That was the test, not how you handled the first sentry, but how you handled everything that came after. Hour 7. The main group arrived. 15 Viet Cong, moving with the confidence of men who thought they were in safe territory. They stopped at the trail junction, started setting up a rest position, 2 sentries posted, both facing the wrong direction because they were watching for threats from outside, not from inside. The others broke out rations, started a small fire, began cooking rice. Kellaway's patrol was 12 meters away, watching, counting weapons, identifying the leader, waiting. The Viet Cong ate, talked. One of them told a joke that made the others laugh. Another complained about the heat, normal human activity. Except it was being observed by 7 men who were controlling every muscle, every breath, every instinct that screamed to move or cough or scratch or shift weight. At 2:14 a.m., 13 of the 15 enemy soldiers were asleep. The 2 sentries were at opposite ends of the camp, both sitting, both fighting their own exhaustion. Kellaway made the decision. His hand moved in the signal they drilled until it was muscle memory. The ambush initiated with a sound the survivors would later describe as like the jungle itself attacking. 7 SLR rifles on full automatic at 12 meters. The entire ambush lasted 11 seconds. 15 enemy dead, 0 Australian casualties. And the critical detail that would define every close ambush after, the Viet Cong never knew the Australians were there until the shooting started. There was no warning, no reaction time, no chance to return fire. Just sudden, overwhelming violence from a threat they hadn't detected. When the patrol extracted, they carried something with them besides their own equipment and captured weapons. They carried the psychological understanding that it worked. The tactic wasn't theoretical, it was practical. And it was devastating. The report Kellaway filed made it through channels to the task force commander, who sent it to Australian headquarters in Saigon, who showed it to their American counterparts. The American response was predictable. They acknowledged the tactical success. They noted the favorable kill ratio, and they asked if they could send observers to see how the Australians were achieving these results. What happened next became legendary in Australian military circles. In June 1966, 3 American Special Forces advisors embedded with an Australian patrol conducting a close ambush operation. The mission was similar to Kellaway's first test: set up on a known trail, wait for enemy movement, initiate ambush at optimal moment. The Americans were experienced jungle fighters. They'd run their own ambushes. They understood small unit tactics. They thought they knew what they were signing up for. They didn't. The patrol moved into position at 1800 hours, found a suitable ambush site, a trail junction with good concealment at 15 meters distance, got into position, and waited. The American observers were positioned with the patrol, experiencing exactly what the Australians experienced. Hour 3, one of the American advisors whispered to the Australian corporal next to him, asking how much longer before they repositioned to a safer distance. The corporal didn't answer, didn't even acknowledge the question. The patrol discipline was absolute. No talking, no matter what. Hour 8, enemy movement on the trail. A Viet Cong patrol, 8 men, moving cautiously. They stopped 20 meters from the Australian position, posted sentries, settled in for a rest. The Americans watched the Australians watch the enemy. Nobody moved. Nobody signaled a withdrawal. The enemy was right there, and the Australians acted like they were watching television. Hour 12, the Viet Cong patrol moved out. The Australians didn't follow, didn't reposition, stayed exactly where they were, because the mission wasn't to ambush the first enemy unit that came along. The mission was to wait for the target, the larger unit that intelligence suggested used this trail regularly. Hour 18, the sun came up. The Americans had been in position for 12 hours. Mosquitoes had fed on them for most of that time. They were cramped, exhausted, and increasingly concerned that the Australians had forgotten they were in enemy territory. One of the advisors later wrote in his report, "I have conducted 27 ambush operations in Vietnam. I have never experienced a unit that maintained this level of noise and light discipline for this duration. It bordered on inhuman." Hour 24, new movement on the trail. This time it was the target, a Viet Cong company-sized element, approximately 80 men moving with full equipment. They stopped at the trail junction, started setting up a camp, not just a rest position. Sentries posted, cooking fires started, the works, and they did all of this within 15 meters of an Australian patrol that had been sitting in the same position for 24 hours. The Americans couldn't believe what they were seeing. The enemy was setting up camp on top of the Australian position, and the Australians weren't reacting. One of the advisors later admitted he was preparing to break position himself because the situation seemed suicidal. Then he looked at the Australian soldiers around him. They weren't tense. They weren't afraid. They were patient, like they'd done this 100 times, like having 80 enemy soldiers cooking dinner 15 meters away was just another day at the office. The Viet Cong ate, cleaned weapons, posted guard rotations, went to sleep. The Australians waited. They'd been in position for 28 hours. Some of them had pissed into bottles. None of them had eaten anything that required unwrapping. None of them had moved more than their eyes. At 034 hours, with most of the enemy company asleep and the sentries at their least alert, the Australian patrol leader made his decision. The ambush initiated with the same sudden violence the Americans had read about but never witnessed. The difference was scale. This wasn't 7 rifles. This was a full patrol with positioned M60s, claymore mines, and interlocking fields of fire. The kill zone was 40 meters long and was occupied by 80 enemy soldiers who thought they were in safe territory. The ambush lasted 35 seconds. When it was over, 63 enemy were dead, 12 were wounded, and 5 had escaped into the jungle. 0 Australians hit. The Americans watched the Australians conduct the post-ambush protocol: weapons check, ammo count, casualty check, evidence collection, rapid extraction. Professional, methodical, like they'd done it before. During the extraction march, one of the American advisors walked next to an Australian private who'd been on the M60. The advisor asked how many times the private had done this kind of operation. The private thought about it and said, "This was my 4th close ambush, first one with Yanks watching." The advisor asked if it got easier with repetition. The private's answer made it into the official report: "No, mate. You just learn to hate yourself a bit less for doing it." That was the thing the Americans couldn't stomach. Not the danger. American soldiers faced danger constantly. Not the violence. American units were conducting equally violent operations across Vietnam. What they couldn't stomach was the psychological cost of the tactic. Because lying in enemy territory for 30+ hours, watching enemies eat and joke and sleep, knowing that you're going to kill them all, knowing that if you're discovered before you're ready, the entire patrol dies, that does something to a human mind that conventional combat doesn't. The American observers filed their reports. They praised the Australian tactical discipline. They acknowledged the extraordinary results. And they recommended against attempting to replicate the tactic with American forces. The reasoning was clear in the reports. Though diplomatically phrased, American tactical doctrine emphasized aggressive action and maneuver. The close ambush tactic required passive observation and patience that contradicted core American military culture. More bluntly, as one advisor wrote in a classified addendum, "These tactics require a level of stillness and self-denial that our soldiers are not trained for and likely cannot achieve without significant psychological cost." The Australians kept doing it anyway because it worked. Between June 1966 and December 1967, Australian forces in Phuoc Tuy conducted an estimated 400+ close ambush operations. Not all of them resulted in contact. Many involved patrols sitting in position for 2 hours with no enemy movement. Those operations were considered successful because they gathered intelligence, denied the enemy free movement, and demonstrated Australian presence in areas the Viet Cong considered safe. But the operations that did result in contact produced kill ratios that made conventional operations look inefficient. Operation Ingham in August 1966 saw a single Australian platoon conduct 3 consecutive close ambushes over 6 days. Total enemy killed, 41. Total Australian casualties, 0. The platoon spent a cumulative 87 hours in ambush positions, some of them within 10 meters of enemy trails and camps. When they extracted, they carried out 14 weapons, 87 pounds of documents, and enough intelligence about enemy movement patterns that task force intelligence could map Viet Cong routes across an entire sector. Operation Bundaberg in October 1966 produced the most psychologically disturbing example of the tactic's effectiveness. An Australian patrol set up a close ambush on a trail junction, and waited for 52 hours before enemy contact. When a Viet Cong platoon finally appeared, they stopped at the junction and set up a teaching session, an experienced cadre instructing newer fighters on trail discipline and ambush awareness. The Viet Cong instructor was literally teaching his students how to avoid being ambushed while sitting 14 meters from an Australian patrol that had been in position for 2 days. The Australians let the entire lesson conclude, let the students ask questions, let the instructor praise their attentiveness, then killed all 18 of them in 22 seconds. The psychological impact on captured survivors was significant. During interrogations, Viet Cong prisoners from that area began reporting something that intelligence officers initially dismissed as propaganda or confusion. The prisoners claimed that Australian patrols didn't ambush you when you walked into them. They ambushed you when you thought you were safe. They were already there when you arrived. They watched you eat and sleep and plan, and then they killed you. One captured Viet Cong squad leader, interrogated after surviving an Australian ambush in November 1966, provided testimony that made it into multiple intelligence reports. We stopped at a trail junction we had used 50 times. We felt safe. We cooked rice. We posted sentries but told them to relax because no one had ever seen Americans in this area. Then the shooting started, but it didn't start from the jungle. It started from inside our position, like they had been sitting there the whole time, waiting for us to settle in, waiting for us to lower our guard. I don't know how long they were there. Maybe minutes, maybe hours. Maybe they watched us arrive and chose not to kill us until we were comfortable. That is what scared me more than the bullets. The intelligence officer conducting that interrogation asked a follow-up question. How does that change your behavior on patrol? The Viet Cong squad leader's answer was illuminating. It means nowhere is safe. It means every position we take might already be occupied by men we cannot see or hear. It means that rest is tactical suicide. But you cannot remain alert forever, so you choose between exhaustion and death, and both lead to the same place. That was the strategic value the Americans missed when they decided not to adopt the tactic. The close ambush wasn't just about kill ratios, it was about psychological attrition. Every Australian patrol that sat in enemy territory for 48 hours created a bubble of uncertainty in the enemy's mental map of safe space. The Viet Cong and NEAA couldn't know where Australians were positioned. They couldn't predict when or where an ambush would initiate. They couldn't develop counter-tactics because the Australians weren't following predictable patterns. The Americans, by contrast, were predictable. Not because they were incompetent. American tactical competence in Vietnam was high. They were predictable because their doctrine required them to be. American operations were big, loud, and mobile. They announced themselves. They used artillery and air support liberally. They dominated territory through presence and firepower. All of that was visible, audible, and trackable. The enemy could see American units coming, could avoid them or prepare for them, could develop tactics specifically designed to counter American methods. You couldn't develop counter-tactics for someone who might already be in your camp, watching you sleep. By early 1967, captured documents and prisoner interrogations revealed that the Viet Cong and NVA had changed their behavior in Phuoc Tuy Province. They stopped using trails during predictable hours. They abandoned formerly secure rest areas. They increased sentry rotations and paranoia protocols. They started treating their own territory as if it were contested. That was the measure of success. The enemy altered their entire tactical posture because they couldn't predict where Australians might be waiting. But the cost was real. The Australian soldiers conducting these operations paid for them in ways that weren't visible in after-action reports. Private Walsh, the Queensland cattle station kid who'd thought his childhood tracking skills would translate easily to military operations, described the psychological experience in a letter home that his family kept private until after his death. The first close ambush, I was terrified the whole time. The second one, I was angry at the enemy for making me wait. The third one, I was angry at myself for what I was about to do to people I'd been watching like a nature documentary. By the fourth one, I'd stopped feeling much of anything. I think that's worse than the fear. Sergeant Kellaway, the architect of the tactic, never publicly discussed the psychological implications. But soldiers who served under him reported that he conducted mandatory debriefs after every close ambush operation. And those debriefs weren't about tactical lessons. They were about making sure his men could still function as human beings after spending days watching people they were about to kill. One participant in those debriefs, Corporal Mitchell, later wrote about them. Kellaway would sit us down and make us talk about what we'd observed. Not the tactical stuff, the human stuff, what the enemy soldiers talked about, what they seemed to care about, whether they looked scared or confident. He made us acknowledge that we'd been watching real people living their lives, and then we'd killed them. He said if we didn't process that, we'd either become monsters or break down. I didn't understand it at the time. 20 years later, I understood perfectly. The tactic's most famous employment came during the Battle of Long Tan in August 1966, though not in the way most histories record it. The battle itself was a conventional engagement. D Company, 6 Ra, caught in the open by a Viet Cong regiment and fighting a desperate defensive action in a rubber plantation during a monsoonal rainstorm. What the histories don't emphasize is what happened before Long Tan, in the weeks leading up to it. Australian patrols had been conducting close ambush operations throughout the area where the Viet Cong regiment was concentrating. They hadn't detected the full scale of the enemy buildup. The jungle was too thick and the enemy too dispersed. But they detected something. Multiple patrols reported observing enemy units moving with unusual discipline, avoiding trails, maintaining noise discipline that suggested experienced troops. The patrols had set up their ambushes, waited, and in most cases found nothing. But the pattern was there, if you knew how to read it. More significantly, the close ambush operations had created a psychological environment that influenced how the Viet Cong regiment behaved during Long Tan itself. Captured documents later revealed that the regiment's commander had warned his battalion commanders specifically about Australian ambush tactics. He told them to expect close ambushes along any avenue of approach. That warning made the Viet Cong units more cautious in their movement, which slowed their assembly, which gave Australian reinforcements more time to reach D Company during the battle. The battle was still desperate. D Company still fought at odds of more than 10-1. But the enemy's caution born from months of experiencing Australian close ambush tactics, was a factor in D Company's survival. Not the primary factor. Artillery, air support, and the courage of 108 Australian soldiers were the primary factors. But the psychological groundwork had been laid by patrols that had spent hundreds of hours sitting motionless in jungle, waiting for enemies who sometimes never came. After Long Tan, the close ambush tactic became official doctrine across the Australian task force. Training became standardized. New arrivals in country spent their first weeks learning the skills, movement discipline, noise discipline, stillness training, and what soldiers called the psychological reset, learning to shut down your normal threat response patterns and operate on pure tactical patience. The training could be brutal. One technique involved taking a section into the jungle, positioning them for ambush, and then having instructors walk through the position acting as enemy forces. If the instructors detected any sign of the concealed soldiers, movement, sound, even the feeling that someone was watching, the entire section failed and repeated the training. Some sections spent 4 days learning to be invisible before their instructors couldn't detect them anymore. Private Andrew Foster, who arrived in Vietnam in January 1967, described his ambush training. They put us in position at dawn, told us we'd be there until someone found us or until we compromised ourselves. My section stayed there for 38 hours. Instructors walked past us maybe 20 times. On hour 36, one of my mate's legs cramped so bad he twitched. Just a small movement, barely visible. The instructor was 15 meters away and spotted it immediately. We failed. Started over the next day. That time we lasted 52 hours before the instructors called it. They couldn't find us. That's when we knew we were ready. But ready for what? That was the question American observers kept asking. Ready to endure psychological stress that seemed unnecessary when you had helicopter gunships and B-52s? Ready to sacrifice comfort and safety for tactical effects you could achieve through conventional means? The answer, from the Australian perspective, was that conventional means couldn't achieve the same effects in that terrain against that enemy. Helicopter gunships were useless if you couldn't find targets. B-52s were devastating but required targeting intelligence that conventional patrols weren't generating. The only way to understand enemy movement patterns, identify command structures, and create genuine fear in an enemy that had been fighting in that jungle for 20 years was to go where they lived and watch them in their own territory. And watching them meant getting close enough to smell them. Captain Robert O'Neill, an infantry officer who would later become one of Australia's most distinguished military historians, described the sensory reality of close ambush operations in his post-war writings. You could smell the enemy's cooking, fish sauce, rice, sometimes the distinct smell of tobacco they used. You could hear conversations, not just voices but actual words if you spoke Vietnamese. You could see their faces in firelight or moonlight. You learned to identify individuals. This one was the anxious sentry who checked his perimeter too often. This one was the confident veteran who cleaned his weapon methodically. This one was the young one who looked scared all the time. When you initiated the ambush, you weren't killing abstractions. You were killing people you'd been studying, like specimens. That specificity was what made it effective tactically and devastating psychologically. The enemy understood this better than the Australians' own allies did. A North Vietnamese Army report captured in 1968 included an analysis of Australian tactics that was remarkably accurate. The report, translated and circulated through US intelligence channels, noted, "Australian patrols operate with patience that exceeds our own. They establish positions inside our secure areas and maintain them without revealing themselves. Our troops report feeling watched in areas where no enemy should be present. This creates uncertainty that degrades morale and operational effectiveness. Recommend avoiding areas of known Australian activity and treating all territory as potentially contested." That final phrase, treating all territory as potentially contested, was the strategic victory. The Australians never controlled Phuoc Tuy Province in the conventional sense. They were too few, but they made the enemy afraid to operate freely in territory they nominally owned. That was force multiplication that firepower couldn't achieve. The tactics refinement continued throughout 1967 and into 1968. Patrol leaders developed techniques for managing the physical demands. How to position soldiers so that cramping was minimized. How to rotate alertness within a static position. How to manage hydration without creating noise or compromising concealment. They developed communication protocols that were almost telepathic, hand signals so subtle that they were invisible to anyone not looking directly at the signaller. They learned to read each other's breathing patterns to coordinate movement. Sergeant Michael Mick Jones, who ran close ambushes throughout 1968, described the communication system. "We developed a language that didn't need words. A specific pattern of breathing meant I see movement. A slight shift in body position meant pass the signal forward. We could coordinate an entire ambush initiation, positions, targets, timing, without making a sound. It took months to develop. But once you had it, you could operate with a precision that talking would only degrade." The Americans tried to learn it. Multiple US units requested cross-training with Australian forces, specifically on close ambush tactics. The Australian instructors would take them through the process, and the Americans would perform adequately in training. But in actual operations, the differences became clear. American patrols could maintain discipline for 6, 1, 2 hours. Australian patrols routinely maintained it for 4, 8, 7, 2 hours. American patrols would initiate ambushes when they had tactical advantage. Australian patrols would wait for optimal advantage, even if that meant watching multiple opportunities pass. A US Army report from 1968, analyzing cross-training outcomes, noted the cultural barriers. Australian soldiers demonstrate patience and stillness, discipline that appears to be cultural rather than trained. Their soldiers come from rural backgrounds, where hunting and tracking are common skills. They are comfortable with extended periods of inactivity and observation. By contrast, American soldiers come from a more active urban culture and struggle with the enforced passivity required for extended ambush operations. Additionally, American tactical doctrine emphasizes aggressive action, which creates psychological resistance to the passive observation phase of close ambush operations. The report was diplomatic. The reality was less so. American soldiers who tried to replicate the Australian method found it psychologically intolerable, not because they lacked courage, but because everything in their training and culture said that when you see the enemy, you engage. The Australian approach: see the enemy, watch the enemy, wait until the enemy is at maximum vulnerability, contradicted American tactical instincts at a fundamental level. Specialist James Rodriguez, an American door gunner who spent 3 months with an Australian unit, described the disconnect. "I watched an Aussie patrol set up an ambush 20 meters from a Viet Cong camp. The camp had maybe 30 enemy soldiers. The Aussie patrol was 8 guys. They sat there for 2 days. 2 days. Watching these guys come and go, cook food, sleep, all of it. I kept thinking, when are they going to call in artillery? When are they going to call for air support? They didn't call anyone. They just watched. On the second night, when the enemy was asleep except for 2 bored sentries, the Aussies opened up, killed 26 of 30. The other 4 ran. The Aussies collected intelligence and extracted. No artillery, no air support, just patience and rifles. I respected the hell out of it, but I also knew our guys would never operate that way. We'd see 30 enemy, and we'd want to kill them immediately, not wait 2 days for the perfect moment." That was the essence of why the tactic remained uniquely Australian. It required a patience that contradicted everything modern military training emphasized about seizing initiative and maintaining tempo. The Australians had grown up in a culture where patience was survival. Farmers waiting for rain, hunters waiting for game, stockmen waiting for the right moment to move cattle. That cultural patience translated to military operations in ways that couldn't be replicated through training alone. By 1969, the Viet Cong and NVA had developed their own counter-tactics, though counter is generous. What they actually developed was avoidance. Intelligence reports showed that enemy units were specifically routing around areas of known Australian activity. They were abandoning trails that Australian patrols had ambushed even once. They were treating Australian sectors the way they'd treat free fire zones. Avoid them entirely if possible. Move through them only with maximum caution if necessary. A captured NVA operations order from June 1969 included this instruction to company commanders. When operating in Phuoc Tuy Province, assume all positions are compromised. Australian forces establish observation positions days in advance of initiating contact. Standard counter-ambush protocols are insufficient. Recommend avoiding trail junctions, known rest areas, and any position that offers tactical advantage. Accept reduced operational efficiency in exchange for reduced casualties. That instruction, accept reduced operational efficiency, was the real measure of the close ambush tactic's success. The enemy wasn't being defeated through casualties, though the casualties were significant. They were being defeated through fear. Fear of an enemy that might be watching you right now. Fear that the safe trail you've used 100 times might have become a kill zone while you weren't looking. Fear that rest is a luxury you can't afford, because the moment you relax might be the moment you die. The Americans never fully understood this, because they were fighting a different war. American strategy in Vietnam was based on attrition. Kill enough enemy soldiers, and the war becomes unsustainable for them. Australian strategy in Phuoc Tuy was based on psychological attrition. Make the enemy so afraid to operate that they degrade their own effectiveness. Both approaches had merit, but the Australian approach required a level of patience and psychological endurance that the American military wasn't structured to provide. The toll on the Australian soldiers who conducted these operations remained largely unexamined until decades after the war. The Australian military of the 1960s didn't have robust psychological support systems. Soldiers were expected to handle stress through mateship and personal resilience. The idea that lying in ambush for 72 hours watching people you were about to kill might have long-term psychological consequences wasn't part of the institutional thinking. Private Walsh, whose experiences opened this story, served 14 months in Vietnam and participated in 27 close ambush operations. He returned to Australia in 1968, received his discharge, went back to the cattle station in Queensland, and tried to resume his pre-war life. In a series of letters written to a fellow veteran in the 1980s, he described what that was like. "I can't hunt anymore. I used to love it. Tracking pigs through the scrub. the patience of waiting for the perfect shot. Now, when I'm in that position, watching an animal through the scope, waiting for it to settle so I can take it cleanly, I'm back in the jungle. I'm watching people instead of pigs. I'm calculating the ambush instead of the shot, so I don't hunt. I tell people I lost interest. Really, I lost the ability to separate hunting from killing. That was the cost the official histories don't calculate. The kill ratios look good on paper. The tactical success is undeniable. But the men who achieved those results paid for them in psychological currency that nobody tracked. Some adapted and moved on. Some struggled for decades with what they'd done and how they'd done it. Some never talked about it at all, which might have been the healthiest response or the most damaging. Nobody really knows. The tactic itself faded after Vietnam. The Australian military maintained close ambush doctrine in its jungle warfare curriculum, but the opportunities to employ it declined. Australia's subsequent military commitments, Somalia, East Timor, Iraq, Afghanistan, involved different terrain, different enemies, and different tactical requirements. The jungle warfare skills that had defined the Vietnam generation became historical knowledge rather than operational necessity. But the legacy persisted in unexpected ways. Australian Special Forces soldiers who deployed to Afghanistan in the 2000s carried with them institutional knowledge of patience and stillness that traced back to those close ambush operations in Phuoc Tuy. The tactics looked different. Desert mountains instead of jungle, Taliban instead of Viet Cong, but the underlying principles remained. Get closer than the enemy thinks possible. Stay quieter than they can match. Wait longer than they can endure. Strike when they're at maximum vulnerability. And the enemy noticed. Taliban fighters captured after engagements with Australian SAS operators reported the same psychological effects that the Viet Cong had reported 40 years earlier. The feeling of being watched, the uncertainty about safe spaces, the fear that positions they'd used for years might suddenly become kill zones. The specifics had changed. The psychological impact hadn't. In 2010, a joint US-Australian training exercise in Hawaii included a module on close ambush tactics. American Marines and Australian infantry were paired up for a series of ambush scenarios. The Australian instructors used the same training protocols that had been developed in Vietnam: stillness drills, patience tests, noise discipline exercises. The American Marines performed well, demonstrating the tactical competence you'd expect from professional soldiers. But the Australian instructors noted in their after-action reports that the American participants consistently showed psychological resistance to the enforced passivity required for extended ambush operations. One Australian warrant officer, teaching the course, wrote, "The American Marines have excellent tactical skills and superior physical conditioning. What they struggle with is doing nothing. They're trained to take action, to solve problems through movement and firepower. Asking them to lie still for 36 hours and watch rather than act contradicts their entire tactical culture." This isn't a criticism. It's an observation. Different militaries develop different capabilities based on different cultures. Close ambush operations require a specific type of patience that isn't universal. That observation captures why "they sleep with the enemy" remained a uniquely Australian tactic. It wasn't about superior training or better equipment. It was about a cultural capacity for patience and stillness that allowed Australian soldiers to endure psychological conditions their allies found intolerable. The Americans brought firepower and mobility. The Australians brought patience and proximity. Both were effective, but only one made the enemy afraid to sleep in their own territory. The final word belongs to the enemy. In 1995, a former North Vietnamese army officer named Nguyen Van Tan published a memoir about his experiences in the war. Tan had commanded a battalion in Phuoc Tuy Province from 1967 to 1969 and had lost multiple units to Australian ambushes. In one section of his memoir, he described the psychological impact of operating against Australian forces. "We had fought the French for 9 years and learned their patterns. We had fought the Americans for years and learned their patterns. We could predict their operations, prepare for their tactics, and survive their firepower. The Australians were different. They did not operate on patterns we could learn. They did not announce themselves. They did not dominate territory through presence. They dominated it through uncertainty. We never knew where they were. We never knew when they would strike. We knew only that in certain areas, at certain times, men who walked point would disappear without sound, or camps we had used for years would suddenly erupt in gunfire from positions we had never suspected were occupied. This created a specific type of fear, not the fear of battle. We accepted that. The fear that nowhere was truly safe. That rest was tactical suicide. That the jungle itself had turned against us. I lost more men to Australian ambushes than to American operations, even though American forces were vastly larger. But more significant than the casualties was the psychological toll. My soldiers became afraid to stop moving, afraid to rest, afraid to use familiar trails. This exhaustion degraded our effectiveness more than the bullets did. The Americans tried to destroy us through firepower. The Australians tried to destroy us through fear. The Americans failed. The Australians succeeded, though not completely. We learned to live with the fear. We accepted it as the price of operating in contested territory, but we never overcame it. Even now, 50 years later, when I think of the war, I think of the Americans' helicopters and bombs. But I dream of the Australians in the jungle, watching, waiting, invisible until the moment they chose to reveal themselves. Those dreams still wake me. That testimony from an enemy who had every reason to diminish or deny the effectiveness of the tactic is the most powerful validation of what the Australians achieved. They made professional soldiers afraid not of what they could see, but of what they couldn't see. They made the jungle itself a weapon through their willingness to inhabit it more completely than the enemy who claimed to own it. The close ambush tactic worked because it violated the enemy's fundamental assumptions about safety and territory. It worked because Australian soldiers were willing to endure psychological stress that contradicted human instincts about distance and danger. And it worked because the Australian military culture, shaped by geography, history, and national character, produced soldiers who could master patience as effectively as they mastered violence. The Americans couldn't stomach it, not because they lacked courage, but because their entire military culture was built on different foundations. They believed in taking ground, holding ground, and dominating the battlefield through superior resources. The Australians believed in watching ground, understanding ground, and making the enemy afraid to occupy ground they nominally controlled. Both approaches had merit. Both achieved results. But only one tactic made enemy soldiers afraid to sleep in their own camps. Only one tactic produced the psychological collapse visible in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. Only one tactic required soldiers to deny their own humanity for days at a time, becoming something between predator and terrain, watching the people they would kill live their final hours without ever knowing the watchers were there. Private Walsh, the cattle station kid from Queensland, survived Vietnam and lived until 2003. He never spoke publicly about his service. He never attended reunions. He never discussed what he'd done in those close ambush operations. But in his final years, suffering from cancer, he told his son something that the son later shared at his funeral. People ask if I'm proud of my service. I tell them I did what needed doing. But pride isn't the word. I accomplished something very few people could accomplish. I survived it physically. I'm not sure I survived it completely in other ways. The jungle taught me patience. The war taught me violence. The close ambushes taught me that sometimes the cost of success is measured in pieces of yourself you can't get back. That was the hidden cost of the tactic that made the Australians legendary and left American observers shaking their heads. You could train patience. You could drill stillness. You could reward discipline, but you couldn't prepare soldiers for what it meant to watch men eat and sleep and joke, knowing you would kill them all, knowing they would never see it coming, knowing that the gulf between observer and executioner would collapse in seconds of overwhelming violence. The Australians did it anyway. They did it for years. They did it so effectively that the enemy changed their entire operational posture in response. They did it until the tactic became doctrine, until new soldiers arriving in country expected to spend days in enemy territory watching enemies who would never know they were there. They slept with the enemy, not literally, but close enough that the distinction hardly mattered, close enough to hear them snore, close enough to smell what they ate, close enough that when the killing started, it was over before the enemy's surprise could become resistance. That was the tactic the Americans couldn't stomach. Not because it was ineffective. The kill ratios proved otherwise. Not because it was too dangerous. American soldiers faced equal or greater danger in conventional operations. They couldn't stomach it because it required a fundamental redefinition of what a soldier was supposed to be. Not a warrior charging forward, not a defender holding ground, but a patient, invisible predator who could watch death approaching for days before releasing it. The Australians proved it could be done. The enemy proved it was devastatingly effective. And the Americans proved that effectiveness alone doesn't make a tactic adoptable when it contradicts the cultural DNA of the force trying to employ it. In the end, that was the real lesson of the close ambush tactic. Military effectiveness isn't just about weapons and training. It's about cultural capacity. The Australians had a cultural capacity for patience and stillness that allowed them to exploit a tactical opportunity their larger, better-equipped allies couldn't match. They turned that capacity into doctrine, refined it through hundreds of operations, and paid for it in psychological currency that isn't calculated in after-action reports. The tactic died with the war. The men who perfected it scattered to civilian life. Carrying memories they mostly kept private. But the principle remained, waiting in doctrine manuals and training syllabi for the next jungle war, the next enemy who owned the terrain, the next generation of soldiers willing to sleep with the enemy close enough to kill them in the dark.